Let me start by thanking you for your leadership on climate change at a time when we all need to pull together for our common good. And I also wanted to acknowledge the continued commitment to climate action that we're seeing in countries around the world, including in Africa. The developed world has made a commitment of mobilizing $100 billion by the year 2020 to address the needs of developing countries, and that's a promise that we must make good on. And I've had a chance to see a lot of the great work on climate change that is happening in the world cities, but even today, as I serve as a UN Special Envoy for Cities and Climate Change, I feel it necessary to speak to you as an American citizen, as a business leader, and as a philanthropist, and as a former mayor of the largest city in the United States. So let me cut right to the chase. I know many of you are dismayed by President Trump's decision to reject the Paris Agreement. I strongly disagreed with that decision, and the day after he made it, I shared a platform with French President Macron and the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, to let the world know that the U.S. will meet our Paris commitment, and there is nothing Washington can do to stop us. And I think it's important for you and the world to understand that the fate of America's Paris pledge does not lie with Congress or the White House, and I'm going to explain today why that is true. Now, few people realize it, but the United States is already halfway to our goal of a 26% reduction in emissions by the year 2025, and Washington has had almost nothing to do with that progress. Cities, states, businesses, and citizens, together with the market, were really responsible for that progress. None of these groups are slowing down now, and my foundation is working to help each of those groups accelerate its progress. As an example, we just announced a new commitment to the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign, it's called, which empowers communities to shut down coal plants and transition to cleaner fuels. Carl Pope, my co-author, is with us today, and he helped actually conceive this campaign, and it has been a phenomenal success. Since it began 6 years ago, nearly half of all U.S. coal plants have closed or begun phasing out, and we're on track to cross the 50% mark by the end of this year. That's something like 250 coal-fired power plants closed or in the process of being closed. And you can see that in the results. Our goals are halfway to being met. The air is clearly cleaner, and the number of people that are dying from the effects of the pollutants put in the air by coal-fired power plants has been cut roughly in half. U.S. communities, cities, and businesses are not waiting on Washington for leadership, and thousands of them have signed a statement called "We Are Still In" as a show of support for the Paris Agreement. And their efforts will allow us to reach our Paris goals, and we will back up that pledge with real data. And in the months ahead, my foundation, along with other partners, will calculate the collective potential of U.S. cities, states, businesses, and universities, along with the market forces that are decarbonizing our economy. And with that data, we'll create our own version of the nationally determined contribution that every other nation submitted as part of the Paris Agreement. And we are calling our contribution America's Pledge. And just as every other nation has done, we will outline our plan for reaching our commitment, and we will publicly report our progress so that the world can hold us accountable for delivering what we promised. Now, it makes perfect sense for mayors to be the leaders on this issue because cities account for 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, about 90% of the world's cities are built next to rivers or seas, which makes them especially vulnerable to rising seas and flooding caused by warmer temperatures. So the cities really are the biggest drivers of climate change, and they face many of its greatest threats at the same time. Just as importantly, mayors recognize that the same steps that reduce carbon emissions improve people's health and strengthen local economies. And by making cities more attractive places to live, work, and invest, the citizens benefit both from an economic and from a social point of view. We don't have to choose between protecting the environment and strengthening the economy. It really is true that we can do both, and many cities have proven that, including New York City. During my time as mayor, we reduced our carbon footprint by 19%, while also creating a record number of jobs. And there was no great secret to our success. We studied what other cities were doing to combat climate change, and we borrowed the best ideas. We also developed new approaches on our own, and it's been gratifying to see that some of those have been spread around the world. To help more good ideas spread, my foundation has supported networks of cities that are devoted to reducing their emissions. We've been longtime supporters of the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, which includes many large European cities. And even though it's called C40, it happens to have 88 members. Do not ask why. Together, C40 cities represent 25% of global GDP, so the efforts really do make a very big difference. But it's not just large cities that are taking action. Last year, thanks to the leadership of President Juncker and Vice President Šefčovič, we helped launch, he's right here with us, we helped launch the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. Now more than 4,000 cities around the world have signed the covenant, and they've agreed not only to set ambitious climate goals, but also to measure and report their progress so that their citizens and their global community can hold them accountable for making progress. The Global Covenant of Mayors grew out of other cities' networks that were started in large part because national governments had long failed to come around together to an agreement. Mayors refused to wait, and during the COP21, Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo and I convened the first ever Global Climate Summit for local leaders. And more than 1,000 mayors and other local officials attended, and together we spoke with one voice in pressing nations to adopt an ambitious agreement. We assured heads of state that cities would help lead the way in carrying out the agreement, and today I want to assure you that hasn't changed, including in the United States. In fact, in some ways, President Trump's decision on the Paris Agreement has had one positive effect. It has galvanized not only the global community, but also American society around the agreement. So 7 in 10 Americans believe now that climate change is real and want government to take action, but that's not the only reason Americans reacted so negatively to the president's decision. I believe the main reason Americans objected to the withdrawal is that they don't want the United States to abdicate our leadership role in the world or to walk away from our global responsibilities. We take those responsibilities very seriously. We've spent decades in building up relationships around the world. Generations of Americans have fought and died not only to protect America, but to protect the values that America stands for and our place in the world. Earlier this year, I visited the Somme and Normandy battlefields in France. Earlier this month, I visited Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. It's impossible to spend any time at any of these 3 locations without being overwhelmed by a feeling of grief for those we lost and gratitude for those who sacrificed their lives to liberate a continent. More than 500,000 Americans died fighting in the 2 world wars alongside millions of Europeans. Their selflessness helped make possible a new world order that gave rise to an era of unrivaled prosperity. Not since the Roman Empire has most of Europe gone 75 years without a war, and that is not an achievement that we should take lightly. And yet, both here and in the U.S., we know political forces have been undermining the political and economic bonds that have sustained the peace, testing them in ways only a few years ago would have seemed inconceivable. Things we once took for granted about each other now appear in flux, as terrorism, economic destruction, and cultural change drive nationalism and populism. A sense of uncertainty and insecurity echoes across our politics and elections from across the oceans and around the world. The messages coming out of the Trump administration on defense and trade and tyranny have been conflicting and confusing, and diplomacy depends, as we all know, on clarity and trust. Britain's exit from the European Union has created its own conflict and confusion, not only with the EU, but also with the US as well. Taken together, our transatlantic alliance is facing a test unlike any before. In the days and years ahead, I think it is critical that we remember that our post-war peace and prosperity were built not only on the sacrifices our soldiers made, but on the partnerships our politicians formed. The United Nations, the Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods Agreement, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, the forerunner of the WTO, and of course also NATO. All were created because our leaders understood that world affairs are not a zero-sum game where one person must lose for another to win. A rising tide really does lift all boats, as President John Kennedy once remarked. And while political currents ebb and flow, I want to assure you that you can always count on the United States to do the right thing after, as Winston Churchill supposedly said, we have exhausted all other possibilities. On climate change, we are currently, you should know, in the exhaustion process. But the American people, through our cities, businesses, and communities, will right, I think, what Washington got wrong, and we will uphold America's end of the bargain. We are still in, and we will take on this great challenge together. When the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres renewed my mandate as the UN Special Envoy for Cities and Climate Change, I told him that I will do everything that I can to help. And today, on behalf of American cities, businesses, and citizens who remain committed to the Paris Agreement, I want to extend the hand of friendship and cooperation to all our partners, European and global. And I hope you will accept our extended hand and welcome us as a partner in the work of saving the planet and saving lives. Future generations are counting on us to deliver. That includes my kids and my grandkids and yours as well. We must not let them down. So thank you for your leadership, and I look forward to answering your questions.